And we can develop the story further with Justin Logan. He's the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute think tank. He specializes in U.S. grand strategy and U.S. foreign policy. Welcome to the day. Let's dive right in. No clear path to NATO membership for Ukraine at this point. In your opinion, should Kyiv receive an invitation to join the alliance?
No, I think that the decision itself not to extend a meaningful pathway to membership for Ukraine was correct. I actually agree with President Zelensky and the ambassador that was just on the show that there has been a considerable amount of double talk and sort of leading Ukraine along to believe that it will someday become a member. But substantively, the Western allies, the United States, Germany, and France have revealed that they don't believe they have an interest in Ukraine worth fighting Russia over. And given that the Article 5 commitment, as Joe Biden has recently put it, is a so-called sacred commitment to treat an attack on one member of NATO as an attack on all, we shouldn't extend a security guarantee to a country we've just revealed we don't believe we have an interest in fighting over.
Let's talk about when Ukraine becomes a member, because at this point, it seems to be a matter of when and not if. Do you think that would deter Russia from future aggressions?
Well, I'm not sure that it is a matter of when and not if at this point. I mean, it's hard to predict 20 years down the road, but I think for the policy relevant future, it's terribly unlikely that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. As to the question of whether Article 5 would actually deter Russia, to kind of go back to the point that I made previously, credibility is a sort of witchy thing, right? It's difficult to quantify. It's difficult to make a commitment credible. And given that in the very recent past, in the present, in fact, we've revealed that we don't believe we have an interest in fighting Russia and Ukraine. President Biden calls such a prospect World War III. There's reason to fear that the Russian president or any Russian leader would say, look, the Americans have said that this would be World War III, and under no circumstances are they going to fight for Ukraine. So why would we credit an Article 5 commitment to Ukraine? And then I think there's a risk that were that to happen, you'd have other very vulnerable countries like the Baltic states, for example, wondering, hey, wait a minute, which kind of Article 5 guarantee do we have? Do we have the kind that France and Germany had? France had during the Cold War and Germany had starting in West Germany had starting in the 50s? Or do we have some other Ukraine type Article 5 guarantee that means something completely different?
So what you're implying is that NATO would never stand up to Russia, or NATO would just never stand up to Russia in Ukraine under Article 5?
It's a Ukraine question, right? If we granted an Article 5 security guarantee to Ukraine and Russia were to attack it, we would have really two choices, right? React as though Article 5 is a sacred commitment. And as President Biden has said, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory, if you'll forgive the imperial measurement. So that would lead to the prospect of a direct NATO-Russia shooting war with the potential for nuclear escalation were we to stand by the commitment. If we were to renege on the commitment and say, well, we'll just send some materiel and money and things, but we're not actually going to fight for Ukraine, then you'd have many other NATO members saying, would the Americans fight for us? Would the Germans fight for us? And I think that is the uncomfortable underlying reality that we face in this sort of strange discussion about admitting Ukraine to NATO.
So what do you think is behind these vague promises of not now, but later, if, in your opinion, there is no real interest of ever including Ukraine in the alliance?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer to it, because in an article that I published last week, said, the honorable thing to do would be, if you have no intention of doing something, plainly admit we're not going to do this, so that Ukraine won't have the possibility of engaging in wishful thinking or hearing what it wants to hear. But they continue to sort of dangle this prospect out there, and I don't know why they're doing it. I think it is. I understand quite clearly why the Ukrainian leadership is frustrated. And it's just my hope that they will kind of read between the lines and understand that this is conceived of in some Western capitals as the kind of polite way to say no, when in fact, I think it's actually quite dangerous and disingenuous.
It is very dangerous, and you can see that there is a lot of disappointment on the Ukrainian side right now. I want to get back to something that you said before, that it's not, in the United States' interest to see Ukraine included in NATO. But NATO was created to deter Soviet expansionism, stop the revival of nationalist militarism in Europe through a strong North American presence, and to encourage European political integration. Now, let's pull all of these principles into the 21st century. Would Ukrainian accession not fit right into this mission?
NATO was founded at a time when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. If you had told policymakers in 1949 or 1950, we're going to keep this thing rolling until Ukraine is a member, they'd have said you were out of your mind. U.S. policy in Europe historically has been counter-hegemonic. The United States' interest is to prevent one country from dominating Europe. So World War I, World War II, the Cold War, these were all scenarios in which there was a prospect that Germany twice and the Soviet Union once could have dominated the European continent. Even if Russia were to conquer all of Ukraine, if it took all of Ukraine without a shot having been fired, its GDP would have gone up by 10%, making it roughly the size of Italy's, and it would have had a second major port on the Black Sea. That does not put Russia in a position to dominate Europe, or even really to threaten Germany or Poland, given the terrible military performance the Russians have had in the first 17 months of the war. So my view as an American is that our interest in Ukraine is limited. It's particularly limited as contrasted with Ukraine's interest in Ukraine, which is almost unlimited. And that's why you heard the Ukrainians last spring, for example, calling for the U.S. to enter the war via a no-fly zone. The U.S. politely declined, and a number of things where the Ukrainians have actually tried to escalate and bring the United States in, right? When a surface-to-air missile from Ukraine landed in Poland,
we only have a couple of seconds left, but I do want to ask you, if national interest really reigns supreme, what's the point in being in an alliance?
Well, NATO was founded at a point when it was very plausible that the Soviets could have come in and taken the industrial heartland of Europe for itself. So I think there was a very plausible argument that we needed to prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Europe. It's just that Russia can't dominate. This Russia can't dominate Europe today.
All right. Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Many thanks.